Thanks for joining us for this archive of Teaching American History's webinar for 6 May 2020. Today's episode, Heroes of the American Founding, focused on Abigail and John Adams and was the first in our American Heroes series of webinars, which will take place during May. Our next webinar in this series will take place on 13 May at 1 p.m. Eastern and will focus on American war heroes, specifically U.S. Grant and Robert Gould Shaw of the Civil War. Thanks for listening.
I want to welcome everybody to our first webinar in Ashbrook's American Heroes series. I'm Jeff Sikkenga, the Executive Director of the Ashbrook Center. As many of you know, the Ashbrook Center is an independent educational center located on the campus of Ashland University here in Ashland, Ohio. We have programs in American history and government that we sponsor both here on campus, but more broadly across the country for students, for teachers, and for citizens. And I especially want to welcome teachers who are joining us through our Teaching American History program. They're coming from around the country to be with us today. So glad that you could be here. I want to thank you very much. We provide a lot of resources for teachers. Our teachingamericanhistory.org website, our one-day and multi-day programs around the country, and then, of course, our master's program. We offer a graduate degree for teachers who are looking for substantive content degrees in their area of American history and government. And in fact, just this week, I got a note from a teacher, and she included a note from her daughter. I just thought it was very appropriate to read for today. To those of you who are in the program, in the master's program, or thinking about it, or to our donors and supporters out there who are helping to fund these teacher programs. It says, Mr. Sikkenga, thank you for teaching my mom American history. She wouldn't have been able to graduate without your program. And that's from Abby. And I think probably Abby is, knowing who her mom is, probably named after Abigail Adams, which is particularly appropriate for our conversation today. So we want to welcome the teachers. I want to thank our donors and supporters and friends for being with us as well. These webinar series that we're starting now in May are really part and parcel of the mission of the Ashbrook Center, which is to strengthen constitutional self-government by educating our fellow Americans in the history and principles of our country and in the habits necessary for self-government. That's Ashbrook's mission. That's been our mission since 1983 when we were founded, and we continue that to this day. And we have a particular way, the Ashbrook way of teaching and learning, which our students and teachers have been engaged in. We don't think of education at Ashbrook as simply information, and we don't think of it, we don't think of it as indoctrination. We think of it as discovering the truth. We go back to the old saying of Aristotle, way back from the ancient Greek times. All people desire to know, but then we add, but they don't want to be told. They want to discover it for themselves. So we want to invite you today, as we always do in these webinars, to discover for yourself again the story of America. That's what we're here to do. We're here to have a conversation with Dr. Natalie Taylor, who is a great friend of ours. And we're going to root this conversation, as I always do at Ashbrook, in the primary historical documents. We're going to let those documents tell the story. We're going to try and bring the past to life, ask it questions, and seek its answers. And as maybe some teachers out there know, when students will ask, why do I have to study history? For us in this webinar series, and more broadly in our programs, we think it's critical to study history, first of all, of course, to get a historical perspective on the current issues of the day. You know, when you study American history, you realize there are not a lot of new things under the sun. America's been through a lot of challenges and crises and situations before. And we can learn from how people thought and acted in those crises to give us some historical perspective, a bit of a deeper perspective on what we're facing today. And I also think it's really important that this studying the past gives us an opportunity to renew our understanding of America and its principles. There's a famous Bible verse many of you may know, be transformed by the renewing of your minds. And this is an opportunity for us to be changed a little bit as citizens by renewing our own understanding of America and its history and principles. And, why American heroes? This is the first webinar of our series. And we wanted to focus on that because we think that we can see the principles of America in the character of her people. That's an idea that goes way back when we're studying history and politics to say, what kind of people are Americans? What does it mean to be an American? We can see the principles of America in the character of her people. Heroes really do show us the American character at its best. And by doing that, it vindicates the idea of self-government. As James Madison said, we rest all our political experiments on the capacity of mankind for self-government. Heroes show us that we can rise to that level, that ordinary people who don't have a famous last name, people who aren't born with a noble title, ordinary people can rise to do extraordinary things. We can rise to the level of equality, as Abraham Lincoln once said. So we want to thank you for joining us today for this webinar series and for being with us to explore what it means to be an American by looking at these great American heroes. And today, as you know, we're going to be looking at heroes of the American founding. And to help us introduce our distinguished scholar guest today is Lexie Murray. And Lexie is graduated from Ohio University and is a current student actually in our Masters of Arts in American History and Government. And I've had the honor to teach Lexie in class. She is an outstanding student, and I know a great teacher. In fact, she's a social studies teacher at Seton High School, which is an all-girls school in Cincinnati, Ohio. That must present some interesting situations and questions for Lexie as a teacher. To complete her degree, as all MAG students have to do, they choose between taking a comprehensive examination, a capstone, or writing a thesis. Lexie is choosing to do a capstone project, which is going to be a very interesting work, focusing on pairing primary sources from women in American history to Ohio's history standards to be used in the classroom. And it'll allow teachers the opportunity to teach a broader perspective on American history, incorporating women's voices and women's perspective in that teaching. It's a really innovative project that I think will add real value to Lexie's teaching and to the education that her students receive. So I want to thank you, Lexie, for agreeing to help us be here today and introduce our guest, Dr. Natalie Taylor.
Thank you. I'm also taking a class with you this summer, so you'll see a little bit more of me. But good afternoon. Thank you for having me. It's truly my pleasure to be introducing Natalie Taylor to you guys today. She's been one of the most inspiring professors I've had in the MAG program, and I've been blessed to work with her. She's also helped inspire a lot of those ideas I've had for my capstone. So Natalie Taylor is an associate professor of political science at Skidmore College, where she teaches American political thought and feminist political thought. She has taught in the MAG program since 2008 and has taught the American Revolution, the Reformed tradition, ratification, and the Adams family, republicanism, democracy, and American history, which I personally last summer was able to sit in on. And it was a real pleasure to hear all those letters between John Adams and Abigail Adams. Professor Taylor is the author of The Rights of Women as Chimera, the Political Philosophy of Mary Wollstonecraft, and the editor of the Political Companion to Henry Adams. She has also written on second wave feminism and its legacy. Her essay, Henry Adams Remembers the Ladies, A Revolution in Female Manners, is forthcoming in a volume of essays on the Adams family and the American Revolution.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Lexie. Natalie, delighted that you could be with us today. Thank you for taking the time to talk about these American heroes, Abigail and John Adams. And I wonder if we could start by having you take us back to early 1776. Some of the documents you gave us start there at the beginning. And sometimes when we think of 1776, we think, of course, of July 4th. And we think of the middle of the year. We don't necessarily think about what's happening and the situation that the Americans find themselves in and that the Adams find themselves in early 1776. Take us back to that time. What's the situation facing John and Abigail, and what's the situation facing the Americans?
Well, first, I want to thank you and Lexie for including me in the conversation. I, like so many of us, are missing coming to Ashland this summer to teach in the MAG program. And so it's really great to see Lexie, and I'm touched by her very generous words. I'm delighted to be here. And so I appreciate all the work that everyone at the Ashbrook Center has done to make this possible. Yeah, you're quite right, Jeff. It is, we generally do think about the revolution beginning in July of 1776, and I often have to remind myself that, in fact, the American Revolution, as we know it, or as we think about it, for the War of Independence, had really started nearly a full year earlier, maybe even a little bit longer. Lexington and Concord happens in April of 1775. In June of 1775, we have the Battle of Bunker Hill. So John and Abigail Adams, at the turn of the year, starting the new year in 1776, are really in a military threat, and they are anxious about their safety and the safety of their friends and family, and they are looking towards establishing a new government. At least John is. One of the most well-known letters that we have from John Adams is a letter that he writes to Mercy Otis Warren, who was a great correspondent to both John and Abigail. And in this letter, he thinks a lot about this change that he's likely to make. It's not just going to be a change of independence, but he anticipates a change in government. He wants to move away from a monarchy to a republic. And as you mentioned earlier, we judge America by the character of her people, and he certainly anticipated doing that. And so while monarchies were sort of rife with music, dancing, and horse racing, which gave even him the feeling of being light and frivolous, he was looking towards establishing a republic that would inspire strength, hardiness, activity, courage, and fortitude. And so those are the things that's on John's mind in January. And I suspect they were also occupying Abigail's as well. It was one of the rare moments in their early marriage where they're actually in the same place.
Can you take us back then? That's so interesting that we're seeing them here in the beginning of their marriage, or near the beginning of their marriage. Can you take us back a little bit and tell us about how this remarkable couple, how they met, where they grew up? Were they lifelong Bostonians, Massachusetts people, or did they come from elsewhere?
Well, that's it. I'm glad you asked, because it reminds us how similar we all are. They had kind of a story that would be familiar to us today. They were lifelong, I guess today we would call them Bostonians. They live probably about 35 minutes from Boston today. John was in Braintree, and Abigail lived just a short distance away. And they first met in 1759. John was visiting Abigail's home with a friend of his, Richard Cranch, who was interested in Abigail's sister. And so they met through mutual friends. And at the time, John was interested in another woman. And so he was a little smitten with a woman by the name of Hannah Quincy. And he kind of lingered and waited a little too long to announce his intentions to Hannah, and she accepted another suitor. And so it was a few years later that he and Abigail started to court. Abigail was still relatively young. At the time, women were married generally around 22, and Abigail was 21. Her parents were a little bit nervous about that, but they knew the handwriting was on the wall and allowed her to begin courting John, or John court him, I guess. And then they were married, I believe it was 1764.
So we find the tone in a lot of these letters you had us look at is very warm. In
Yeah.
fact, sometimes they address each other as friend. I know some folks out there might be surprised when we think of the 18th century, we think of very formal relations, and especially in letter writing, even perhaps between a married couple, very formal. What was their relationship like at first? This doesn't sound like it was necessarily an arranged marriage, but
Not at
did
all.
they like each other right away, or was it one of these stories that it took a little time?
Did take a lot of time. I think initially, even though John was had romantic intentions that for another woman, he respected Abigail immediately. He thought she was clever and smart, a good conversationalist, and they did begin corresponding relatively soon. Abigail had been a great correspondent generally, and I kind of work mostly in her letters with John, but I think if you read more widely, you'll see that she's an amazing correspondent and very quick, as we can see, playful at times, and you say warm. So yeah, I do think that although John was thinking about someone else, he did have immediate regard for her for all of the ways that we've come to know Abigail as being smart, engaged, articulate, and respected that immediately.
And of course, John Adams, at least later in life, did not have the reputation of being the easiest human being to deal with.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have any evidence of that in their early relationship at all?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't think so. Not from Abigail, at least. I mean, now that you mention it, I think she's really very forgiving of some of the character traits that we might generally associate with John. As I mentioned, she is quick, and so I think she knows how to handle him a little bit. And she speaks her mind. Obviously, the letter you mentioned from 1776, I think she's quite serious and about her views on women, but she doesn't seem to back down. She's a pretty formidable woman herself, and so and arguably difficult as well. I mean, she also has a reputation for that.
Well, can you tell us, Natalie, a little bit more then about, so as we get into 1775 in Boston, it's the hot spot for the American resistance to the crown.
Mm-hmm.
And it begins to look like there's more revolutionary fervor growing and independence talk is in the air. Were the Adams, and in fact, I noticed that in one of the letters you had us look at from March 31st of 1776. So again, months before Americans declare independence, Abigail writes to John, and I was surprised by this. She says, "I long to hear that you have declared an independency." She seems very pro-independence at a time where I think we all know out there that, even John Adams himself, I think, estimated not more than a third of Americans were in favor of independence that early. Now, maybe more in Boston, but I'm surprised by the strength of her views on independence. And what were she and John known to be pro-independence and pro-American, particularly since John Adams, as people recall, had been involved in defending the British soldiers who killed colonists or Americans in the Boston Massacre.
Yeah, I do think you're right that their enthusiasm for independence came largely from their circumstances in Boston, as we had been talking about, not only in the previous 6 or 8 months were the circumstances getting more and more dire, but John had been slowly gaining his reputation in Boston, certainly, and I think becoming a more and more conspicuous advocate for independence. So, as you know, the Sugar Act and the Stamp Act were passed in the mid 1760s. John was opposed to the Sugar Act, but the Stamp Act was, unacceptable to an attorney, and so he had become involved in opposing Parliament's measures at that time. And then, as you mentioned, in 1770, he defended some of the British soldiers who were involved in the British massacre. And he did that, I think, less because he was loyal to the crown and more because he thought that it was an important thing for an attorney to do. He made a comment at the time, something to the effect that the last thing a person should want in a free country is legal counsel. And so it was a matter of principle to him that he would defend those soldiers. And so I wouldn't take that as an indication that he was becoming ambivalent. It was more about his commitment to Republican principles, I think. And so as the time goes on, he does get elected or serves in the Continental Congress. And so in March of 1776, he's in Philadelphia, and that's the occasion for their writing.
So we get to early 1776. John is in Congress. Abigail is back home in Massachusetts.
Right.
As you say, she didn't join him there in Philadelphia. What's the situation like back on the home front? She alludes sometimes in her letters to the situation being pretty grim, and that she is left to take care of the household, not just run the household and the education of the children, but essentially manage the farm. It's quite an extraordinary situation for her to be in back on the home front.
Yeah, and I think many of us have seen HBO's series, the John Adams, and so especially in these days where we're under stay-at-home orders, I cannot get the image of Laura Linney scrubbing the floors to rid the house of contagion out of my head. And so she is in these circumstances where disease is prevalent. The British soldiers are there. She has 3 young children to care for and a farm. And so we often remember her, I think, as really very independent and also sort of brave in these moments. I think that's the only thing we can say about it. And yet she is also very adamant that John should continue to do the work that he's doing.
And in fact, one of our folks and our audience participants has said, many people have said that during this time there would be no John Adams, as we understand him, without Abigail. Does that seem right to you? And particularly, I'm thinking of John Adams was called by his fellows. Once he gets into Continental Congress, whatever ambivalence or sort of maybe he wasn't as radical as people like Samuel Adams at the time or James Otis, but he gets more and more convicted that the need for American independence has come. And in fact, he becomes later called the Atlas of Independence. He sort of puts independence on his shoulders and carries it in the Continental Congress. And again, we think today that, well, of course, all the Americans by 1776 are in favor of declaring independence. But we know that that's not quite true. So what are the struggles that John has to face when he's away from Abigail? She's facing her own struggles in Boston. What are the struggles that he faces in the Second Continental Congress to try and get independence to happen?
Yeah, so it is a struggle to do that. I think, the colonies were under various circumstances politically with respect to their relationships to the British Crown and Parliament, but then also to one another. And so he has simultaneously to have to convince the other colonies that the threats that he is so familiar with in Boston and that Abigail is enduring while he's in Philadelphia are really threats to all of them, and that it isn't simply a matter of a particular problem in Boston, but that it speaks to the kinds of possible problems that the other colonists will have. So there's that line of argument, and then another line of argument that he has to sort of engage the other delegates in is that they should act together, and that they all had separate relationships to the Crown and to Parliament, and so they saw themselves as quite independent. Efforts had been going on for maybe about 20-25 years at this point to work in concert in certain ways, but they really didn't necessarily see themselves, certainly not as a nation, but then as necessarily sort of engaged in a common endeavor. And so he's got a lot of political problems, numerous in Philadelphia that he had to sort of to manage. I guess I'm interested in that question that one of the attendees had mentioned about there would be no John Adams without Abigail, and I do subscribe to the theory that behind every good man is a good woman. But I would also say that there may not be a kind of republic as we know it, or we come to know it, without Abigail Adams. One of the books that, or portions of a book that we read in the American Revolution class, or at least as I've taught it in the MAG program, is Gordon Wood's The Radicalism of the American Republic. And one of the things that Wood notices is that we often go back to John Locke's Second Treatise as a way of trying to understand the American experiment and the government. And Wood argues that we probably should take a second look at Locke's some thoughts concerning education, because the real radicalism of the revolution was in the equality that's established between fathers and sons. And I would argue that that equality is established by mothers. So as Adams is engaged in the politics of starting the revolution, declaring independence, Abigail is at home and she's trying to instill into her children all of those virtues that John had written to Mercy Otis Warren about, right? Strength, courage, fortitude. Those are the things that will enable a republic to persist and to thrive as much as the political institutions that John is working on.
And it's interesting. I love that list. This is from that letter you mentioned of the January 8th, 1776. And boy, wouldn't we all like to have children like this? John Adams says, he says, I prefer he says, but a republic, though it will infallibly beggar me and my children. So he's not sure he's going to prosper in a republic compared to the monarchy they're living under. He says, will produce, and this is what you were talking about, strength, hardiness, activity, courage, fortitude, and enterprise, the manly, noble, and sublime qualities in human nature in abundance. So it's not just a change of government that he and Abigail are looking toward, or a separate country. It's a whole different kind of human character that they both sort of embody at the moment, but they want to see throughout the country. And it strikes is really great contrast to me. The other letter you had us look at from 14th of April, when John talks to Abigail about the people from Virginia or the southern colonies, which of course, unlike the North, where slavery is legal in the northern colonies, but not very prevalent, he talks about this inequality of property gives an aristocratical turn to all of their proceedings. So that Southerners like Jefferson or Southerners like George Washington or others who show up deal in the American Revolutionary Movement, there's a little bit of a different character to them. And I'm just wondering, how does that sit with a New England man, a small R Republican character like John Adams?
Yeah, it doesn't sit well as we know, in both in declaring independence and then also a decade later in drafting the Constitution. The question of slavery was nagging, and men like Adams had to compromise on their principles, I think, in order to get those agreements. But the Adams statesmen, not only John, but his son John Quincy and subsequent generations, Charles Francis Adams, Henry Adams, they were really very proud of their opposition to slavery from the start. And so it maybe speaks to Adams's pragmatism that he could recognize the need to compromise with the slave states in order to accomplish independence and finally the Constitution. I think that that letter you're pointing to, Jeff, is so interesting because this is also the letter in which Adams responds to Abigail's claim that he should remember the ladies and that he should treat them in a less tyrannical way than that maybe the law would allow, and or even earlier generations. And so John is really very sensitive to how a republic forms character. On the one hand, he's committed to equality, as you've just suggested, and has been an early and consistent opponent of slavery. But on the other hand, he also knows the dangers of leveling that comes with equality. And so that it really speaks, I think, to his very subtle mind about the nature of equality and how, and his thoughtfulness about how it is to be established.
Yeah, and in fact, he says one of the criticisms of republics and by the people who sort of want to remain part of the British monarchy, and he says, when she says, remember the ladies, for which he's very famous, right? One of probably the most famous quote of Abigail Adams. And then I'm taken by this part of the letter from April 14th, where he says, we have been told that our struggle, which is the struggle for independence and for a kind of natural equality between human beings based on their natural freedom. He says, we have been told that our struggle has loosened the bands of government everywhere, that children and apprentices are disobedient, that schools and colleges grown turbulent. So that there's a criticism that once you take down the hierarchy of monarchy, you'll open Pandora's box, and everybody now will feel like they can disobey everybody else.
Yeah, and he really, speaks to the kind of chaotic possibilities that equality has. And so if we think back to this letter and his writing here, and then those passages from his letters to Mercy Otis Warren, I think what's really remarkable about it is he is wrestling with a problem that is as old as Plato, right? We know that this is the problem of Book 8 of the Republic, in which tyranny looks like license, right? The tyrant in the Book 8 would be happy to let the people engage in cards, backgammon, horse racing, cockfighting. But ironically, it takes a kind of self-command that he's talking about to have those other virtues and strengths that he's so interested in fostering in a republic. And so it is maybe a little bit counterintuitive that we need those virtues, even as we are maintaining a kind of a social hierarchy, or maybe a better way to put it would be a social order. And that's what really lends itself to freedom, rather than the kind of, how does he put it, vain, light, and frivolous, insignificant pleasures that we might seek.
So what he's saying, it sounds like what you're saying is, for John Adams, if we're going to have a new country based on individual freedom, we also need the character of the people to have personal responsibility, self-control, self-discipline, and all those difficult virtues that if you're not going to be controlled from the outside, you need to control yourself from the inside. Right. And is that how they raise their children? You mentioned John Quincy Adams, and Abigail Adams has the remarkable distinction, I think until Barbara Bush, of being the only woman and person in America to be both a mother, a wife, and a mother of an American president. So can you talk a little bit more about in this early American, during the Revolution and afterwards, how did they raise their kids and educate their kids?
So they, I think they were both very much involved in their children's education. We have, been talking about the many reasons why we know John Adams to be a hero of the Revolution, but maybe in the public sphere. And I think we can also include him to be a sort of a private hero to his children and his grandchildren. And he did, in many ways, become involved with their education. Reading the letters to John Quincy Adams that both he and Abigail wrote, you can detect a different tone. John is much more encouraging of asking John Quincy Adams to read Thucydides, to keep a journal. And Abigail is, on the other hand, much more attentive to John Quincy Adams's moral character, and particularly as John Quincy leaves home, he had the really lucky blessing, I guess, to be able to go with John Adams as John went during the Revolutionary War to try to secure loans on behalf of the new nation. He took John Quincy Adams as his private secretary. And so it, is the kind of internship every one of our students would love to get and have. And he was there at a very young age. He was probably 13 or 14 at the time. And so Abigail Adams wrote to him several letters and was continuously reminding John Quincy that he had this opportunity to learn, that he should comport himself with honor to his nation and to his family. And so he is, he gets both the explicit, but then also the experiential learning that comes from both parents.
And that's so interesting. I was just looking at that letter from Abigail to John Quincy in 1780. So the revolution is proceeding. It's really moved to the Southern theater, most of the fighting at least. And some people at least are looking to the end of the revolution. What kind of country is this going to be? And as you say, John Quincy is now going to be embarking with his father on this really important diplomatic mission. And he's 13 or 14. My own son is 14. Just to think of a young man like that going abroad with his father under these difficult circumstances. And it's just striking. It sounds like maybe mothers perhaps haven't changed, because Abigail says to John Quincy at the end, she says of the letter, "You must curb that impetuosity of temper, which I have frequently chided you." So she's saying, please control your anger. You're a young man. And she's sort of imparting last moral advices as he's going out the door.
Right. And and I've had to correct my 14-year-old on anger management issues, as we call them in our house as well. But I am no Abigail Adams. I do think motherhood has changed. And perhaps I shouldn't be so hard on myself trying to measure up to Abigail. She does, in another letter to John Quincy, tell him that, as she writes, that great necessities calls out great virtues. And she says, when a mind raised and animated by scenes that engage the heart, then those qualities which would otherwise lay dormant wake into life and form the character of the hero and the statesman. And so, she's really not just telling him to manage his temper. She's also letting him know that she and the nation expects him to be a hero and a statesman. And so that she sets that bar pretty high for him.
Yes. And one of the things that several folks, our attendees, have asked is about the place of religion and the role of religion in the Adams family, in John and Abigail Adams' lives, and in their vision for that in the New Republic. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about, they're coming out of an area of the country that at the time at least is Puritan, and they have a number of references in their letters to divine providence, the supreme governor of the world, and talk a little bit about the place of religion in the Adams household.
Sure. They both came out of religious homes. Abigail is the daughter of Reverend William Smith, and so he had been a minister in Weymouth, neighboring Braintree, for 50 years. And so Abigail was, raised in the Congregational Church. And I'm wishing Sarah Morgan Smith or David Tucker were here to help us think a little bit more about the differences of the Congregational Church. My understanding is that it is a sort of more liberal descendant of Puritanism, but still, I think recognizable to the kind of Puritan spirit that we generally associate with the area. And John also was raised in a very religious home and had come from a line of ministers, and there was some expectation that he himself would become a minister, and he chose the law instead. And so they were very compatible religiously. I think it lent itself to a kind of common understanding that they were engaged in this, as you suggest, a kind of providential project. And also reinforce their spirit of service.
And as their life goes on and the revolution is won, Adams and his enterprise has been successful. He goes abroad and is a diplomat. And fair to say he has a mixed record there, but he comes back and he's confronted with the question, are he and Abigail going to be part of the public life, the political life of the new country? And one person asks the question, is it fair to think of John and Abigail as sort of America's first political partnership? And could you talk a little bit more then about their place in American politics after the revolution and when he becomes vice president and then even president?
Yeah, so I do think it's fair, first of all, to say that they do have a political partnership. I think, and we've talked about that in a couple different ways, then maybe I would just tease out to be more explicit. As the panelist had mentioned, that without Abigail's efforts to maintain the home and the farm, John would not have had the ability to go on to serve in the Continental Congress and be a leader of the American Revolution. So just in that sort of very practical way, she was his partner. But then as we have been talking more about their independent and mutual relationship with John Quincy Adams, we can also see a partnership forming there. And so that they are both engaged in raising literally the next generation of statesmen. And so they, in large part because of their religious bearings, they do have common purpose in that regard. Neither one of them, and perhaps for different reasons, were terribly happy in Washington. And some of Abigail's letters to her sister in particular sort of reveal that. And then, one of the other elements that we haven't talked about, but, is certainly worth talking about with a group of historians, is that John encouraged John Quincy Adams. He himself was, a prolific writer. And so by keeping journals and letters in the way that all the Adamses were wont to do, they really are pass on a kind of, I would say, a kind of virtue of keeping the Adams family history. And given that there were 4 generations of Adamses who were in the public eye, they really start to keep the history of the United States. And so as we think about their John Adams and Abigail's Adams successes as a political partnership, judging from his time in the White House, I think we might be discouraged by his legacy. But I think if we think more broadly about his writings and the kind of expectation that his children and grandchildren would continue to write, it's a remarkable legacy in that regard.
And it's almost as though you're saying, and it's a really interesting idea, and thought of this, that sort of the history of the family of the Adams is really the history of the United States.
Yeah.
Through much of it. And so talk a little bit more then about John and his time as president. So, because again, what we think about John Adams is, well, had a big role in the American Revolution, kind of got lucky by being picked by George Washington to be his vice president, coasted on Washington's coattails into becoming president, was there for a term, not very successful, gets beat by Thomas Jefferson, who they had been, I think, fairly warm friends during the revolutionary struggle, but then everybody knows they had a real falling out, and they had a political falling out, and even became a little bit personal, which they sort of repair at the end of their lives. But in the 1790s, in that first decade, will this republic be a successful experiment, or will it crash the way a lot of other republics have in history? What do you think of the criticism that John and Abigail didn't have a very successful public life as president? Or do you think he's been unfairly overshadowed by people like George Washington and Thomas Jefferson?
Well, I think you're kind of asking me 2 questions. I think the first, my answer to the first part of that question is that he didn't have, I think, as successful a presidency as the others, perhaps. But then the second part of that question is why? Was it that the circumstances, if we think about some of the Alien Sedition Acts, for example, or was it John? And so I am tempted to say in response to that maybe he has been unfairly treated because he was more prickly than certainly Jefferson and Washington. He wasn't as concerned maybe about his reputation and appearances that might have helped both the other statesmen to be more well remembered by the public. And so I guess that's a way of hemming and hawing about a little bit of both, that he had some certainly challenges that he didn't rise to during his presidency, or didn't comport himself as maybe one might. But then also I think his temperament didn't help him either.
Is it that because, and you mentioned that Abigail just didn't like Washington.
Yeah.
And it seems to be true of a lot of people who go there. Some first ladies go and they really thrive in that atmosphere. And some of them, you can tell they just hate it and want to get out of there as soon as they can. What role did she play when John was president or vice president? What role did she play with him personally or politically?
Yeah, well, I think that it's a fair point to say that, and maybe this is the most really very poignant part. I will admit that Abigail of all of the Adamses is sort of the hardest to get to know, at least for me. And I think it gets back to, we've seen her letters to her son, so she is going to, obviously be a tough customer and have really very high standards for what it means to live in a Republican government. And so the kinds of activities and duties that a first lady might take on, or that we've come to associate with first ladies, didn't come naturally to Abigail. When John Quincy was to be married, she was very worried about Louisa Catherine, who was John Quincy's bride, saying that, she had been educated in Europe, and so she spoke French, she knew how to play music, and, all of the things that she was suspicious of, because they were contrary to, those Republican virtues we've spoken about. But those are the kinds of characteristics or kind of attributes that might make socializing in Washington and among other politicians, even in the late 18th century, a little bit easier. And so she just didn't, maybe it's unfair to say, but she didn't seem to like that kind of, kind of social atmosphere.
So part of being a hero for John and Abigail is their amazing role in the American Revolution. And as you're sort of suggesting, not just in the revolution, but in the way that the revolution ends up producing a republic and not a monarchy, which is not a foregone conclusion. It takes people acting and thinking and talking along those lines. And that Abigail and John clearly play a powerful role in that. Part of it as being a hero is, he loses. He's right, the first president to lose an election. And no one knows, maybe nobody knows, as it's been often called, the Second American Revolution, the election of 1800, right? Because nobody knows, what if a president loses? Will they just leave office, or will they stay? What's going to be? There's no historical precedent for that. And he, even though it's a very bitter election, there's a kind of moment of heroism, at least to my mind, for John, because he willingly walks away.
Goes home.
The republic is more important than my presidency. I'm going to go back to where I came from and re-enter private life. And then, so talk just a little bit about John and Abigail after the presidency. He goes back to Massachusetts. He continues his life there on the farm, and he strikes up again through Benjamin Rush, a mutual friend of he and Thomas Jefferson, this remarkable letter writing and maybe even friendship later in life between he and Jefferson, where he says the time has come for us to explain ourselves to each other.
Right.
Can you say a little bit more about his relationship with Thomas Jefferson later in life? And I also know that Abigail and Jefferson corresponded.
Right. I'd be happy to say something about that. But can I go back to your other point? I'll ask the questions here, Jeff.
Yeah, all right, fair enough.
I really liked that point about the Second Revolution happening in 1800 when he simply goes back to Braintree and resumes his life as a private citizen. And I just finished reading the Lyceum Address with my Introduction to Political Philosophy class. And so for those of you who haven't had the pleasure, you should look up Lincoln's Lyceum Address and read it. And the question that Lincoln is thinking about there is, what do you do when the revolutionary heroes are literally dying away? And so I might add that even in the election of 1800 and John Adams leaving office, turning over power to another political party, the principles of the American Revolution and the legacy of the Revolution still isn't secured. We really need that next generation of statesmen to be able to lead the republic. And when that happens, then we might rest a little bit easier. And of course, we know we all have to be sentinel. So I would say that, in thinking about Abigail and John Adams' efforts to make sure that the next generation could govern and be without that revolutionary generation is also really important. So I love that you brought up the 1800 election. So the correspondence between Jefferson and Adams, I think, is another way that we might think about his political legacy, and in being one that perhaps is more important than his reputation as a president. As you mentioned earlier, the relationship between Adams and Jefferson did get very fraught and nasty. And so their ability to reconcile in itself would have been, something to cheer us all in these sort of hyper-partisan times. But I think going back and reading those letters, we get more than just a reconciliation and a kind of happy ending. We really get to see two of the greatest minds of the United States weighing the questions that challenged the founding, questions about slavery, for example. And so they are remarkable documents, both for, as you said, the reconciliation, but then also for the kind of political thought that comes out of the nature of American democracy.
And one of the attendees had asked, in those later years, Abigail Adams and Thomas Jefferson corresponded some. Did Abigail Adams like Thomas Jefferson? Some people really liked Jefferson, as you know, and some people really didn't like him. And where was she on that?
I think she liked him. Jefferson had been very good to John Quincy. He had taken John Quincy under his wing, Jefferson, that is, in France, and so and had been part of his, entourage there. He'd been the private secretary of him in France, and so that also helped John Quincy in developing his resume of sorts that made him ready for diplomacy. And so I think Abigail had been corresponding with him. Jefferson is that for a number of years, and so she liked being. Let me put it this way, because we didn't talk about it so much, except for the one phrase in the Remember the Ladies, is that she really was engaged in politics, and I think had a very sort of quick mind, but then she was also interested in talking about it. And so she tried in various ways to do that. She did have this correspondence with Mercy Otis Warren, who was another woman in Boston who was politically attentive, but there weren't that many people for women to talk to about politics amongst themselves. And so she would naturally seek out the kinds of people that John was talking to. And that's the way in which she, I think, fell into correspondence with Jefferson over the years. So,
that's fascinating. Thank you so much. I mean, there's so much to Abigail and John Adams, to the family of the Adams. And let me recommend, I noticed you mentioned Natalie, David McCullough's wonderful book, John Adams.
Right.
There's that volume for folks who might be interested. And then you mentioned it, and other folks have asked in the question, there's a series by HBO based on McCullough's book called John Adams,
right.
which I would highly recommend to citizens and to teachers and their students. It's really a interesting and in many ways accurate portrayal of the life of John and Abigail Adams. Shows the difficulties they went through, but also the heroic actions that they took. So I think it's a really nice way to get, to see the kind of things we're talking about here. So I want to thank Natalie for joining us today. I really appreciate that. And I want to thank you all for joining us as well. There's so much more we can talk about, but we're going to continue this series, this webinar series. If you want to learn more about Ashbrook, please go to ashbrook.org. is the website for the Ashbrook Center. And if you're interested in primary source documents, historical documents, we've got the largest collection in the country on American history and government at TAH, Teaching American History, TAH.org. So let me encourage those of you who are teachers, or right now, like I am and my wife, homeschool teachers to students, please check that out for resources. It's a wonderful, wonderful collection. Let me also let you know that there'll be a link to a recording of today's webinar so that you can send it on. You can listen to it again to pick up so much of the rich information and knowledge that Professor Taylor gave us today, or send it on to your friends, send it on to your children, grandchildren. We'd love to have that spread as far and wide as possible. We're going to continue with the American Heroes series. We will be talking next week on American war heroes. We're going to be talking with Dr. Dan Monroe, who's also a faculty member in Ashbrook's graduate program, on Ulysses Grant and Robert Gould Shaw, two heroes of the American Civil War. Very complex and interesting people, very different men, but in some ways connected by their heroism in American war. So join us next week for American War Heroes. The week after that, we're going to be talking about heroes of American business. Particularly, we're going to be focusing on Henry Ford and Madam C.J. Walker, who many of you may not have heard of, but there's in fact a Netflix series about her that just started up. So she's becoming known, and she was the first self-made millionaire, female millionaire in the United States, and an African-American woman who was a significant importance in early 20th century American business. So we're going to focus on Henry Ford and Madam C.J. Walker at Heroes of American Business. We're going to conclude our series in May with Heroes of American Medicine. We're going to take a look at Clara Barton, founder of the Red Cross, and Dr. Jonas Salk, the creator and discoverer of the polio vaccine, which again is such an important question in our day and age. What does it take to discover a vaccine? What kind of person and human being does that? So please join us for all of these webinars. You're invited. Again, this is part of our mission at the Ashbrook Center to educate our fellow Americans on the history and principles of this country, and to do that by looking at heroes. We really do believe you can learn from history, gain a deeper perspective on the current issues, and as I said, renew our understanding of America and its principles. It gives us hope in these uncertain times when we look at the character of people like John and Abigail Adams. So, as always, stay healthy, stay hopeful, and stay connected with Ashbrook. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks again for listening. Make sure to sign up for our next American Heroes webinar, American War Heroes, to take place on 13 May 2020 at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. We'll focus, as I mentioned before, on Ulysses S. Grant and Robert Gould Shaw, heroes of the Civil War. You can find more information about this program at tah.org. Thanks so much.